All right, you goddamned accursed. Welcome to another episode of Curse of Politics. We're not going to lie. It's only our second episode of the year, and Jenni Byrne, Scott Reid, and I are sick. Sick, I tell you, of talking about COVID here on the show. Sick of fighting about COVID on the show. Sick of saying the word COVID over and over and over again in our show introduction. So it stops here. Today, we're imposing a COVID moratorium. We've got an episode completely devoid of that word, other than the 4 times I've already said it. Today, it's a Curse of Politics mailbag. We asked you to send in your questions via the socials. Blessedly, you complied with some thoughtful queries we'll do our best to answer. Maybe we'll even sprinkle in an embarrassing story or two. Plus, we'll do our cursed clipping. This week, it's Aaron Wary's column on the looming fight about healthcare. And don't forget to stay right with us till the bitter non-COVID end. Fuck, that's the 5th time I've said it. For our weekly Hey Yous. Jenni, Scott, how are you guys? Scott, I've got a sense of how you are, but maybe we'll start with Jenni.
I'm doing great. Great. I am in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, actually Sunrise, Florida. I'm 5 minutes away from where the Panthers play. I've got tickets to see Edmonton play in February because I have not seen Connor McDavid play live, and I want to see him play. Canucks are in town tonight, so I'm doing fantastic.
Connor McDavid has more ability than the entire Canadiens forwards put together, right?
Yeah.
It's fucking sad.
Yeah.
Anyway, that'll be fun. Scott,
yeah.
You're doing all right?
Yeah.
Homeschooling? How's the math coming along?
It's super good. Because remember, the kids are in French immersion. So it's not just math, but it's math as taught in French, which makes it a slam dunk for the old boy. I'm super capable of navigating that. Yeah, Jenni's in Sunrise, Florida. I'm in Sunset, Toronto. And let me tell you, the shadows are growing long around me. I don't know. What can I say? It's just a grind. So,
you know, Jenni, the streets are empty up here. Like, it's really quiet in this town.
Because, what would people be out doing? They've been told not to go to work. There's no restaurants open. There's nothing open. Why would people be out and about when it's minus 30 degrees?
No. Exactly.
Shadows are falling. I've been here all day. Too hot to sleep. Time is running away. It's getting dark, Dave. It's getting dark.
Is that your Dylan?
That's Dylan.
Yeah.
Not dark yet.
Yeah. All right. Let's start with a question. Let's see what we got.
All right.
Robert Bob McGuire.
Robert Bob?
On Twitter. Hello, Robert Bob. He says, how independent is the Senate? Discuss the experiment. Has quality of sober second thought improved or fizzled? So, I had a former senator on the Herle Burley before Christmas, Andre Pratt, who told me wasn't very independent at all, that's why he left, was because he felt under enormous pressure from the government to do what they wanted him to do. I don't know. What do you think about this whole Senate thing, Jenni? The new Senate, the old Senate, the Senate. What's your take?
Well, I don't think it's changed. I don't think anything changed from. I don't think it's. I would agree with Andre Pratt. I think that anyone that thought it was going to actually change are probably naive in terms of working in partisan politics. So all it did is I guess it was smart for Trudeau in a way. He can say the Senate is independent. So if things go sideways or if there's a problem within the Senate caucus, he can say nothing to do with me, they're independent. But of course, the leader of the Senate still, is part of the Liberal caucus, I believe. So the marching orders, so to speak, are still being driven by the government, which is in our system of government how it should be. It should be. So I'm not surprised that it didn't change. I'd be more surprised if there was actually an independent Senate, but I don't think there's been no evidence that the Senate is anything but the partisan, it's represented by partisan actors like it always has been.
You're an old reformer. Were you a fan of the Triple E Senate, Jenni?
I was. It was never a big issue. Like, it was never a big driving issue for me personally. And it was a big issue for a lot of people in the Reform Party in the West when I was first becoming active. But so yeah, I would have supported the reform policy on that. But it wasn't something that drove me in terms of public policy.
Yeah, Scott, you give a shit about the Senate one way or another?
Yes, I do give a shit about the Senate. I hate it. I've always hated it. I think the place should be surrounded by angry villagers with torches, and no one gets out. That's the way I've always felt about it. And we have friends who are senators on all sides of it. Now it's like a 7-sided aisle because there's 100 different sort of caucuses. I sort of disagree with Jenny, though, that it's just a partisan body, because I think that's one of the things that I hate most about where it's going. And I think it's a big confused mess now, right? You've kind of got you got conservative senators who are acting like a partisan caucus, which makes perfect sense in a parliamentary system. And then the Liberals decided that they weren't going to be partisans anymore, but you kind of have, it's like, so they appoint people who go, well, I'm not here as a partisan. I'm here because of my independent brilliance and my integrity. So those people think they're legislators, independent free agent legislators. Or you got the progressive Senate group. I may ought to have all this right? But you got the conservatives, you got the progressive Senate group who says they're there for the betterment of Canadians. Like literally, so the rest of you can suck poll because you're obviously not here for the betterment of Canadians. Only we are guided by
Dennis Dawson says the smartest person in any room is obviously the independent senator. The problem becomes when there's more than one of them in the room.
Yeah, and then that's a different group, though. There's a progressive Senate group, then there's the independent senator group. Is there still a Liberal? Is there still a vestige of a Liberal?
No, I think they got absorbed into the progressives.
So and then you got the Conservatives. The Conservatives act like an organized partisan group, which, people complain about it. But it's like, well, I don't know. No one asked them for permission to quit being political, so why wouldn't they? And I think you end up with this weird sort of kind of constitutional Frankenstein where it's like some people think they're there on individual merit and they're there as freelance free agent legislators. Some people think they're kind of they like Andre Pratt's feel like they feel like they're still under pressure to kind of, because the guy who appointed me, I ought to feel some fealty to him. So I'm kind of a quasi-liberal. When push comes to shove, I ought to support them. But, then you've got other people who are exposed. So you end up with this institution, which we've always known actually does have a fair amount of power if it chose to exercise it. Now, populated with people who are going to use it for partisan purposes, people who are going to use it where they don't think that they owe accountability to anybody. They're just independent senators. People who have their own agenda. Like it's just, to me,
how has it affected legislation passing? It hasn't at all. It's not like they've held the Liberal government's feet to the fire in terms of passing legislation, which ultimately, for like just a practical point of view, is what the Senate does. So it hasn't changed anything. It's just handicapped. It's just given less tools for the Liberal Party to have in terms of resources. But it hasn't.
I think it's
people there used to know what they were, right? Yeah. Like when I got involved in politics, everybody in the Senate was there as a partisan, and it was either a reward for years of service, or you were a bagman. You were a fundraiser. And those people knew that they had no authority or legitimacy to challenge government policy. They were there, and they were graded on, frankly, how much work they did for the party and how effective they were at the party. Remember Dave Stewart wanted to be in the Senate, former Liberal leader in Saskatchewan, and he told Pierre Trudeau that he would be by far Trudeau's hardest working, most effective senator. And Trudeau looked at him and said, Davey, my hardest working senator is the vacancy.
To me, it's impossible. Many of the provinces had, bicameral parliaments at one point, right? And they gradually eliminated their senates. But, everybody goes, well, we can't do it because it's constitutionally impossible. And I recognize that that's the case. But I still think, one jerry can of gasoline and a good box of wooden matches would take care of the joint. And I don't see that Canada would be any the less for not having it around.
And I think a lot of people feel that. Well, I think a lot of people feel that way, Scott. I think that the vast majority of people that have never met a senator, dealt with a senator, couldn't name a senator, completely feel that way. In terms of like the partisanship, though, if you look at after the '93 election, when the Tories got wiped out and they only had John Charest and Elsie Wayne, it was the Senate caucus that actually kept that entire organization afloat. It was the Senate caucus that was hiring staff to be able to make sure the House was even. Like the question period, like that.
That was true in the '80s for the Liberals too, to a lesser degree, but for sure, right?
Yeah.
I think I might have worked for a senator part-time. I think I was partly on a Senate payroll at one point when I came in. I think, maybe
Well, the Senate's never flexed more muscle than when Alan McEachin was the Liberal Senate leader and they blocked the free trade agreement in the House.
Yeah.
In the Senate. They blocked the free trade agreement in the Senate so it couldn't pass. They wouldn't pass it until Mulroney called an election.
That could happen now, right? But with like the complicating factor of you could have a bunch of them come together and go, well, we are independent senators of progressive mind who think that we are above and beyond the greasy till of politics, and therefore we're going to do this because it's in the country's best interest. We've given these people keys and a car, and not sort of said, sorry, you got to have it back by 11. Like it will eventually do something goofy.
But there's no evidence. They're in no way. They haven't even hinted that they would do something like that. They've completely. It's for all intents and purposes, except for name. It's a very functioning liberal majority Senate.
Yeah. All right. Hey, let's move on to our clipping of the day. Aaron Wary of the CBC wrote a piece yesterday about the looming healthcare fight in the country between the provinces and the federal government, perhaps, but also between advocates of universal single payer and advocates of some version of two-tier. And the argument is that Canadian healthcare is inappropriately funded, inadequately funded, and COVID has revealed that our hospitals are consistently operating right on the brink of capacity. That emergency rooms and ICUs are always almost full, and that this is one of the indications of governments underfunding healthcare. And the more that is the case, the more the argument is, well, people should have some alternative to that system if it's not appropriately funded. And other people say, well, if you had a second system, it would relieve it. Anyway, these debates are coming back, and they're coming back in large measure because of the failures of the healthcare system, or the weakness of the healthcare system as revealed through COVID. And the reality is that the federal government share of funding has declined dramatically over the years. And I was a big part of that. If I take any credit for being associated with the deficit wars of the 90s, you've got to take the downside too. And a big downside of that was massive cuts in transfers to the provinces, which resulted in cuts to healthcare. People have been scrambling to make up for that ever since. And, one of the downsides of that is the federal fiscal contribution to healthcare is the only lever that the federal government has for enforcing the Canada Health Act. So the Canada Health Act lays out what the principles are of Medicare in the country, universal, single payer. And if a province doesn't adhere to those rules, the penalty is that you get money withdrawn from your transfer. But at a certain point, you may get to a place where the provinces say, actually, your contribution is so minor that I'll give it up in order for the savings that I would get through policies that would break the Canada Health Act. So I think this is a serious and real debate, and as somebody that maybe it's bred in your bones when you're in Saskatchewan, but I'm just a 100% believer that this is one of the core elements of the country. It's pretty disturbing. Scott, what do you think?
I think this is a perfect example. First of all, I think it was a great piece by Aaron, and I think it is an important debate that's going to happen, whether people like it or not. I think that this is a good example of my sort of two things thesis, which is that two things can be happening at the same time that might seem contradictory, and they aren't necessarily related. Two things can be happening that are both true. So I think it's absolutely true that we're going to be forced to have a discussion about the proper increase of the federal share of healthcare funding. I just think that's happening and will happen, and it's going to happen, and the federal government's going to have to make moves on that. And I reject the argument that hasn't been explicitly made, but has kind of been implicitly made over the last number of months, which is, look, now is not the right time to have that discussion because we're dealing with this once in a century calamity. I do reject that. I don't think that the funding and the financing, which is so apparently been not de minimis, but it has been declining and has declined to whatever it is, 22, 23% or whatever from the feds. I don't think that there's anything that says we don't need to deal with that now. And I think the needs are so present because of COVID and the thing. But the second thing, which I reject even more strongly, is this notion that, well, the healthcare system has been exposed. No, it hasn't been exposed. It hasn't been exposed by COVID. We know what the strains and the stresses in our healthcare system are. We have a publicly funded single payer model that gives us a bunch of advantages. It creates some stresses. There always are going to be financing and resource allocation challenges and all those kinds of things. And we know that. But the idea that those who have always argued that they would like to see a greater element of pay or a two-tier where people can buy private care in addition to what you would get from the healthcare system, that they are saying, well, see, COVID demonstrates that we've been right all the time. We've been right all along, and now's the time to dismantle the system. My view is a once-in-a-century calamity does not tell you anything about your sustaining permanent system. And it is definitely the wrong time to say, well, now we ought to blow up publicly funded healthcare and a single-tier system and a publicly financed system. But that doesn't mean that we should hesitate from increasing funding for it, both in the immediate term and in the longer term, because I think both things are apparent and have been apparent for a long time.
Well, it's 2022, Herle Burleyites. How's it going so far? Yeah, I thought so. So, to bring a more positive vibe to things, I want to embark on a bit of a good news story here on behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS. We're going to tell it over the course of the next number of weeks, and it's got some pretty wonderful themes. High-speed wireless connectivity for all of Canada, not just big cities, but all rural and remote areas and Indigenous communities. Faster and broader access to the healthcare services and health tech innovations we need. Online learning environments that won't sputter and glitch and take forever to download. How important is that right now? The ability to adopt precision agriculture technology sooner, which will dramatically lower carbon emissions and help in the fight against climate change. And finally, Canada's ability to recover economically post-COVID and innovate with the rest of the world. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here. It all starts with 5G spectrum, which I know you've heard of. 5G is short for fifth generation. And spectrum are the radio waves that let your cell phone and Wi-Fi transmit data. 5G isn't just faster. It's up to 100 times faster, with benefits that will meaningfully improve the lives of Canadians, regardless of where they live. It'll make all those wonderful things I talked about possible. Here's where we are in the story right now. The introduction. The government is holding public consultations on the best way to auction this 5G spectrum to potential carriers. That's a great thing. They want it to be fair. They want it to be universal. They want it to spur competition so monopolies don't result, and Canadians get the best product at fair prices. Over the next few weeks, chapter by chapter, I'm going to tell you the whole story. So stay tuned, Herle Burleyites, because there's a lot more to it, including the role you can play and how TELUS wants to get 5G right for all Canadians. Jenni, you must have scar tissue from watching Stockwell Day holding up a no two-tier healthcare sign at the 2000 leaders debate in the election. Has the politics of this changed since then?
Well, I think COVID has actually changed the politics in terms of this. Our healthcare system was on the brink. If you look at actually ICU admissions in Ontario, in 2015 there were 10,000 less, or 10,000 more ICU admissions in the province of Ontario than what there was in 2020. A non-pandemic, far from pandemic year. So I think our healthcare system has been strained, and anyone that's spent a lot of time within the system, anyone that themselves have been sick or have had someone that has gone through the system in terms of a serious illness or kind of a catastrophic event in their life, will be the first people to tell you what the deficiencies in our healthcare system, are in terms of different wait times and what have you. And so I think that it's a genuine, it's an absolute genuine question, and I think Canadians are more and more looking for different options. I'm not saying that Canadians want to completely go, we go from our system to the Americans 100% pay. I don't think that people are there, but I think they're in for, if it's adding different private services to make wait times for people that can't afford it, I think they're open to doing that. We see it even with tests in terms of everyone scrambling to get COVID tests. If you can afford it, you can walk to a private a private company that provides COVID tests, and you can pay $150 and you can get test results within a half an hour. I did that when I flew to the US. I walked, by the time I walked, got my test, and by the time I had actually walked home, I had already gotten the test. So it's already in the system. Like, for people to say that it's not already there, it already is there. And so I think what Canadians are going to be looking for is there a way that there can be certain procedures and certain different procedures and what have you that can actually be done privately if you choose to actually go down that route and pay for it, which will also then take a strain off the system.
I worry that some people who have, a slightly different ideology, like a Scott Moe, for example, who's got MRI clinics in Saskatchewan that are in violation of the Canada Health Act, and the federal government doesn't enforce that. The people like
no, but they do. The federal government did. The federal government did with Moe. That's last year. That was the controversy, because the reason that what Moe said was not people can pay to go for an MRI clinic, but those clinics also have to provide the exact same amount in terms of taking the strain off hospitals.
Yeah, but you're still directing resources toward private delivery. So there's two issues. One of which is
there's private delivery, but there is private delivery of other services, David. Like, there's private abortion clinics which are paid for by different healthcare providers.
Yeah,
that was actually Trudeau actually threatened to remove funding for New Brunswick because they weren't actually giving money to a private abortion clinic.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you, Jenny, that we've had a lot of creeping private delivery, and I'm not even sure, to be honest, how strongly I feel about private delivery. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me that over time that's going to be cheaper than public delivery. I don't know why that would be, but I'm less hung up on that for sure than I am hung up on single payer, which I think is the line that can't be breached.
That's where I am. That's where I am from a policy perspective, and I also think, and so anybody with a pinch of sense knows that there's private delivery elements within the system, but it's within the context of a publicly funded single payer system. And so, to me, there's a political dimension to this, right? There's an obvious political partisan dimension to this, and I just think it may be that you're right, Jenny. It may be that the percentage of people that are willing to contemplate a greater provision of private delivery, if I can just pay for it, I can get it because of the testing experience and that kind of stuff, and they see that happening in their own life. But my suspicion is that there is a huge risk that conservatives, coming off of all the challenges of COVID and how they have been inconsistent and incoherent in their arguments around it, that if conservatives take the risk of believing their own bullshit and saying, you know what, I think now is the time to crack this debate open, they will pay a punishing political price. So I know people get all wound up on Twitter and start saying this shows us that the system doesn't work and it's time to take change, and why doesn't Aaron O'Toole or other conservatives or this premier who's a conservative show the balls to do more? I think that would be a grave mistake, because if you start saying to people that you're no longer dead certain on that single payer principle, you're going to find yourself on the wrong end of voters' butt facts.
That was the case maybe in 2000, but let's maybe in 2004 too. But one of the things that interests me about this issue is that you will never do a poll of Canadians, asking them what the most important public policy is to them, in which they don't answer, in which healthcare is not at the top of the list, in which the largest number of people don't say, I care about healthcare a lot. And yet it is rarely a salient political issue in campaigns. It is very difficult to make that a political issue in campaigns. You know, I think Jenny, about when the Harper government announced that when the agreement with the provinces ended, that the transfer was going to be reduced from 6% annually to 3% annually. Ignatieff tried to make that an issue in the federal campaign of 2011. It wasn't an issue in the federal campaign of 2011. It's very hard for opposition parties. Nova Scotia did it hugely successfully in this most recent provincial campaign.
But that wasn't...
They did it with a very dramatic policy, though, a very dramatic breakthrough policy that was obvious to people. And maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's what Jeff did.
But that wasn't just on funding. When politicians start throwing out we're going to spend millions here or millions there, it's just white noise to people. It's just they're just talking about transferring money to governments. The reason that Tim Houston was successful in terms of Nova Scotia is they have such a dramatic doctor shortage, especially in rural communities. So people were feeling it. So it was talking about doctors in communities. It wasn't talking about we're going to get more money here and we're going to transfer money around here. It was actually something tangible that people understood, because they knew in their communities they hadn't had a doctor for a decade or so, and so that's why it was successful in terms of a political issue. But I think that if it's just a debate between politicians talking about how much money they're going to throw into different budgets, I think they've lost people.
Yeah. But one of the things they did is they surprised people, right? I remember. Brad Wall telling me that one of the things you need to do when you're in politics is pleasantly surprise people by doing something that's different from what they would expect from you from time to time. And Houston ran on a campaign of expanding the deficit in order to deal with that doctor's issue that you were talking about, Jenny, right? And that was so counterintuitive for people that I think it conveyed to people, holy fuck, they are serious about healthcare. This is not lip service from the Conservatives. They've thought this through and they mean it, because they're prepared to have it really seep into their fiscal policy. Anyway, interesting.
I just think there's political risks on both sides. I think the Conservatives got to be careful with the rhetoric. And I don't think anybody's been uncareful about the rhetoric, but just if you look at Twitter sphere, right? Which is its whole goofy little insert world.
Which isn't real. It's
which isn't real. But if elected Conservative officials were to start to interpret that as maybe real and get motivated by that, that would be a mistake. And I think there's an equally huge risk for the Liberals to appear to be indifferent to demands for increased transfers. I think if they don't take that issue off the table, they may find themselves on the raw side of how much they're for healthcare.
Right. It does all start with too big a cut in 95-96, Scott. Too big a cut in 95-96.
Yeah, I think that's right. If Paul were here, he would tell you, but within 3 years, we had more than restored it. But we all know that it set a trajectory, and it created that perversity.
So our sponsor, CN, likes to say that it's building the railroad of the future. That means a bunch of things: more precise scheduling, creating a more diverse workforce, acquisition of cutting-edge technology. Modern trains are becoming rolling computers. Safety, 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 and containing climate change, among others. On that last file, CN's relentless work on shrinking its carbon footprint is paying off. In fact, CN has just been named to the environmental A-list by CDP, an international nonprofit that scores companies worldwide on their dedication to building a sustainable economy. CDP stands for Carbon Disclosure Project. A-list means, A-list. This year, CDP assessed nearly 12,000 companies. 200 were singled out as high performers. Companies CDP says are leading the way to a net zero future. CN is pretty proud of that. Pretty proud. Actually, CN's approach to greening its operations is quite simple: transporting cargo with a minimal impact on our environment. Since 1993, CN has reduced emissions from locomotives by 43%, thereby avoiding 48 million tons of GHG emissions that would otherwise have gone into the atmosphere. The railway has ordered a fleet of electric trucks for the final mile of delivery and has even commissioned a battery electric locomotive. It's an indisputable industry leader in fuel efficiency and is working to lower fossil fuel consumption even further. And just recently, CN joined the Race to Zero campaign, committing to setting targets in line with the goal of holding global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2050. Herle Burleites have heard me say this before. One train takes hundreds of trucks off of our highways. CN provides a greener, not to mention much more dependable, supply chain. That's what the railroad of the future means. All right, back to the mailbag, folks. Colin Carmichael on Twitter says, is there any ballot question for the Ontario election beyond COVID? Does anything else matter? How do the NDP and the OLP run campaigns based on we probably could have done better? So, it's a good question. Is the Ontario election campaign in June about COVID?
Well, I think it's obviously going to be policies around COVID. I'm not sure how any election isn't. It's something that's just affected all aspects of our life, not just on the healthcare stuff that we've been talking about. It has. And so if you look, it was interesting. Mike Crawley from the CBC put out a bunch of access to information or freedom of information, whatever they call them in Ontario, in terms of polling numbers from last year in terms of the provincial government handling. And it showed that basically as time went on and as lockdowns went on, that the favorabilities or people saying that the Ford government was on the right track steadily went down. And it actually, where the big boom, like the big number where it changed was the end of April, mid to end of April of last year. And that's around when of course the playground policy, the playground policy where they shut down playgrounds and then flipped on that. So it's just showing that wasn't a healthcare related thing. So I think it's showing that this is going to be a challenge for Ford, just like it's going to be a challenge for Legault and any other government this year in terms of COVID policies. But everything kind of ties to that. So you're seeing, with the carbon tax coming in, gas prices have gone up even more. You've got inflation, which is increasing the cost of groceries for everyone. It's not COVID related, but they all tie in. They all tie in together into terms of where people's mindset is.
That poll was had the same result as a poll I saw about Joe Biden the other day, which is that they're getting their worst scores on cost of living. They're getting their worst scores not on COVID. They're getting their worst scores on what's happening to my wallet. And so I can't believe, you and I have talked about this, Jenny. I can't believe that isn't going to be an issue in the election campaign.
100%. Well, there's a reason Biden has every chance he can get has signaled in the states that COVID is done for all intents and purposes. Every chance he has got in the last 2 weeks, especially, it's been like, we are past COVID. Like, let's not, nothing to see here. We are past it. Schools will be open and what have you. Like if Trump said a year ago or a year and a half ago, some of the stuff Biden has said in the last 2 weeks, people like you guys would have been like all up in arms in terms of him not taking COVID seriously. But I think that probably the Democrats and his people are basically saying, no, people have moved on from this and they're actually worried about paying their mortgages and paying their rent and putting food on the table.
People like you guys. People like you fucking too. What a fucking pair you make, Herle and Reid.
Weak.
People like
she's
you
calling
guys.
us weak, right?
I know.
She thinks we're soft and weak.
Not one nut to share between the two of them. What a toothless pack of tigers we are, David. Fine. I'm not going to rise to your undignified challenge, however, Jenny. I'm just going to return to the question and focus on good public policy and smart politics. That's what people tune in for. I think I think it's really a super interesting question. I think it's a really perplexing question because it's so because COVID introduces such a volatility, right? So two questions that occur to me right off the top. One is, and you cite the data from that Parks decision, Jenny, which was obviously such an ugly moment. I think still was the high water ugly moment, even with everything that's happened this past month. But then this past month has been a kind of a bumbling exercise by the provincial government, even with today's news that schools will return next week, because it kind of comes out of the blue. It's like, well, what's the basis of that decision? I mean, how does that relate to the decision you made before when you said we didn't have to go online learning, and 3 days later they did have to go online learning. Now they don't have to stay with online learning. Like, what's driving all this? Anyway, so the question to me is, one, has that stuff, does it settle in to a permanent impression on the part of voters about the competence and coherence of the Ford government? And does that enable you as an opposition leader to say, what COVID has really told us as much as anything is that this guy can't piss in a straight line? You kind of made this argument last week, David. You in very explicit terms in your "Hey You," which I enjoyed immensely, but I'm not as convinced as you are. So I'm not as convinced. Which takes me to my second question, which is, at the time of the campaign, will we be out of COVID? Will we be swamped by COVID? Will we be in another interregnum between variants, like between waves? I think that matters a tremendous amount, because if we're swamped by COVID, then that's, I think, obviously the worst possible place for Ford to be in, because it highlights all of those questions. If we're not swamped by COVID, then it leaves time for all kinds of other discussions where, we're going to talk about cost of living. We're going to talk about economic management. We're going to talk about economic recovery and who's best to manage that. You're going to be talking about schools and all that stuff. I kind of default to, for right now, I think a place that Del Duca and, the NDP could also go this way is really, 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 really focus on schools. And we've talked about this before. Jenny has talked about this before. And I know you're going to have to fill the economic discussion when the economic discussion comes, and you're going to have to be comment on that. But I think I'd try to pull a Houston, where he made his whole campaign tangibly and understandably about moving the yardsticks on healthcare. I would try to do the same on schools, and therefore leverage the benefit of the Ford government's fumbling of schools and education and back to school and all those things that cause so much abrasion for people, and say, listen, right, I know this, when in terms of getting our society back on track, getting through and getting past COVID, preparing ourselves economically for the future, enabling people to participate at their jobs fully. I know this, our schools have got to be better served by their provincial government. They haven't been by these guys, and bang, bang, bang. So I would try to make that my signature issue and pound on, because I think you get to harvest the benefit of COVID's negatives for Ford without risking like you're fighting last year's battle. Like I don't think governments got elected by talking about what they did. I don't think opposition parties get elected by saying, well, remember when the government screwed this up. So I'm really attracted to the schools issue. I think the person that owns that that could be your Rosetta Stone. The person that owns the education and schools issue may well turn out to be the next premier.
Yeah, I agree with you, Scott. We've talked about it before. I wouldn't make it about schools, though. I'd make it about kids. I would basically, if I was Stephen Del Duca, my message would simply be not even about schools, not about teachers. My message would be, I know as a parent that the best place for kids to be every day in terms of learning is in a school. That it is where they learn best. They see their friends for a whole host of reasons, not just from an education point of view, but from a mental health point of view for a growing. Can you imagine? Like, go back and I, your kids, Scott, like the younger boys. Like, I can't imagine being that age and having 3 years where my school was interrupted and I didn't get to see my friends, and you didn't get to, play outside and all the stuff that you remember, like, recess in grade 5. I remember more of. I remember more about recess in grade 5 than I do probably about what happened in the classroom. And so if I was Del Duca, all I care about, my election campaign is going to be on your kids and your kids.
I was bullied at recess in grade 5.
Oh,
Graham Bell was my bully. Yeah.
Sean Clapp and Todd Law. Scotty's little softies.
Big nose.
Scotty's diapers. Wipe your ass with Scotty's diapers. I'm going to
break the rule. I'm going to introduce a COVID question, but just about politics. Okay. Just not about the substance, just about politics, and really narrowly.
Preaching your own.
Why has no opposition party, no matter how desperate they are in this country, advocating for mandatory vaccination when polls show that a majority of Canadians support mandatory vaccination?
Well, I think that it is a very hot button issue. There is a majority. I think I saw a poll out like earlier today or yesterday that came out that 70% of Canadians support, 70% of Ontarians supported mandatory vaccinations, but that's 30% that are not just vocal, but there's 30% also. I've said this before. We probably all know someone or know people that are not vaccinated. Like we talk about it like sometimes commentators talk about it in terms of like a black and white, and they're not. It's 30% of Ontarians. That's a big number, and those are the people we probably all know people. We all love people. We all care about people who have decided for whatever reason to not get vaccinated. And so I think it becomes a very personal issue, even for people that are vaccinated like us. I have my 3 vaccinations, and mandatory vaccination makes people squeamish. And I think I've said this before, the vast majority of people are not the people that you see out protesting different politicians or what have you. I think it's a very silent majority of the minority of people not vaccinated that are more for whatever reason hesitant to get vaccinated, and you know, the argument that some will make against it, you see with the Omicron virus. You saw the WHO has come out today and said they don't even know if the current vaccines that we've all had, there's any efficacy in terms of the different variants. There still has to be more testing. They know that in certain.
But if you're Del Duca and you're at 25 to 30%, why aren't you jumping at a 70% proposition? Scott?
It's a good question. I don't think it's pure strategy and math. I think that, you look at it and you say, well, that's a good trade. That's good trade voter-wise. I think it's probably even better than that, because if you take a look at Del Duca's voter coalition, he's not spilling any votes. Those that are hesitant, and that would object strenuously to a mandatory vaccination policy. Probably there are very few of them within a liberal or liberal NDP coalition. So, it probably makes sense, but I through that prism. But I think people can't help but apply that other really kind of screen to it, right? Like, it is a big step. You are saying we are going to force you to take this health measure. And yes, we ask people to immunize themselves. And so maybe it's not unprecedented. I just think in the teeth of this thing and the emotion of this thing and the heat of this thing, it's a tough call for politicians to make. I think that they recognize that they would have to position themselves as saying, yes, I have decided I'm going to tell you what's better for you, and I'm going to do that. And so I think there's probably just a little bit of human announcement, but look, people may go there. And it may ironically be easier to do once we're past the next wave. Like, it may be like, now that we're out of the woods and we can take a breath and we can move around, now's the time to have this discussion and say, listen, right, not happening again. So maybe that will make people feel that it's more comfortable to have that political debate right now. I just think there's just a human element where people go, God, man, it's such a volatile, emotional, raw time. I feel awkward about bringing that hammer down. But as I said last week or the week before, I think this debate is going to start to unleash, because if these restrictions have to be extended or there's a new variant, people are going to, the majority, the overwhelming majority is going to get fucking mad at the underworld.
But Scott, from a logical point of view, the WHO is saying that the vaccines aren't working against the variant. So the argument would be,
I don't think I'd hang my hat on that complete argument, and I don't know that that's a fair characterization of everything the WHO
the people
said.
We now all know. So COVID now, not to get into COVID, where I'm sorry everyone
You're doing it.
I know,
it's your goddamn fault, David. You said we're not going into the water. Then you said, let's just test the water. Let's put one ankle in.
But in terms of vaccination, as I said, I am fully vaxxed. I got vaxxed in the States and I'm in my I like the 21 days between the first and second, the 6 months between the second and third, all of the Pfizer recommended times. And I know a lot of people over the holidays, like everyone else, that got COVID. It became abstract to a few people. I had an aunt and uncle that got it, in the summer. It now became that I know more people that didn't have COVID than what had it. And all of them that got it were at least double vaxxed, and some of them had the booster. So So then the argument, and they got it from people that were already vaccinated. And so the argument that
let's not go down this road, because the indisputable reality is that you're less likely to get it if you're doubled, and you're much less likely to get it if you're tripled.
You're less likely to get sick. You're less likely to get sick.
And then you're also sick, both things. So I don't, let's not, I think it would be a weak hook to hang much on this.
Okay. And by doing this, I have wasted too much time, and we now do not have an opportunity to handicap the Conservative leadership race. Because we can't do that in 5 minutes. That is a discussion. And so, accursed next week, we'll be handicapping the Conservative potential replacements for Aaron O'Toole next week. But this week, we're going to close out. Who better
poised than me and David?
Exactly. So this week, we're going to close out with Gordon Pinsent and our Hey Yous.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right, I'll start. My Hey You goes out, and it's pretty pedestrian this week. My Hey You goes out to all the provincial governments on the testing side of things. There's been a big gap emerge on testing, which is nobody can get a PCR test anymore. In fact, people are told not to get PCR tests. And yet, it is unclear what the implications of that are for people who need to apply to workers' comp or for other benefit programs for being away from work. And so if you didn't get a PCR test, what evidence do you have that you have COVID? I think this is creating a lot of anxiety for a lot of people that are in this situation. So I think some clarity out of governments about how they're going to be viewing this. And I don't see what choice they have really but to accept everybody's word for it. Because they've told people that if you have cold symptoms, assume you have COVID and stay home. And so I think that they're just going to have to take people's word for it. But right now, there's a lot of uncertainty. I know in Saskatchewan, Workers' Comp announced that they will not be accepting a rapid test as evidence, only accepting a PCR test as evidence. And of course, you can't get a PCR test. This is known as a catch-22. So fix that and relieve some anxiety for people. Jenni?
Well, my Hey You is kind of something that I probably Hey You'd about before, and it's kind of pedestrian as well, David, as well, in terms of the reporting of COVID hospital numbers. And so this is something we talked about back when we were first talking about COVID 22, almost 23 months ago, in terms of the people that are in hospital because of COVID and the people in hospital with COVID, in terms of if you've been in a car accident. And it's even to the point, I saw a clip online of Jake Tapper on CNN that was going after one of the regular contributors, doctors on CNN, going, we are now irresponsible in terms of reporting if we continue to report the numbers in terms of what you're saying, the New York numbers. Because if New York has come out and basically said that 43% of people that are in hospital and being told, like, for COVID, actually are in for other reasons. They just happen to be in the hospital. They got tested and they have COVID. And so I think there's got to be more and more as we kind of go into this stage of living with things. There has to be more honest reporting, and I don't blame the reporters on this. I blame the governments and kind of the hospital administrators. Is there has to be more information because people are very high. They have a high awareness of what the difference between what the nuances between the two. And so I think that in terms of that as well as other things, there has to be more honest reporting of the stats and figures around COVID hospitalizations.
Thanks, Jenni. Scott?
My Hey You is to Stephen Lecce and Doug Ford. Don't just give me the news I want to hear. I'm not a goat. I don't just wag my little goat tail when I get the oats that I'm looking for. Of course, I want the kids to go back to school on the 17th. But I'm equally troubled by this because I have no idea what it means. I have no idea what context it's happening in. So for the love of God, hold a press conference. Don't just give a leak to my pal Rob Benzie. Always want all the leaks to go to Benzie, but still, like, maybe embellish this with a little bit of transparency and some discussion. So how is it that you came to this discussion, this decision? To Jenny's point about the data, how many, and your point about testing, David, I mean, how do we know? Like, does this mean that we reached the point where we think that we've hit the peak and that it's on the downslope now, and therefore we can mitigate the risk and we're comfortable as compared to where we were 10 days ago? Does this mean that we recognize that there's actually just no telling, that the harms are so pronounced when it comes to keeping kids at home that it's not outweighed by the benefit, if there is any benefit, of trying to keep people from circulating, and we've decided, screw it, these measures haven't worked, and so we're just going to put them back into the schools. Don't tell me that there's been 3,000 filters, as I read today in the Toronto Star, as though that is some kind of meaningful number to me. 3,000 filters in schools? I don't know. If the demand was for 3,100, then I think you've done a terrific job. If the demand is for 14 million, I think you've done a shit job. I don't know what that is. What about the handing out of masks? What about the availability of antigen tests? What's the context in which this decision is going to be made? I'm not going to decide, if I'm going to be blunt, I'm not going to decide, unless a comet hits, to withhold my children from school because the harms are too pronounced. But I'd like to know what it is that's going on behind these decisions. I'd like to know what measures you've taken in the time that you purchased for yourself by delaying the return to school. Don't just say to me, great news, you want cake, I bought you a cake, now shake your little goat tail.
All right, good one. Thanks, Scott. Listen, thanks both of you. So great to see you this week again.
And thank God we were able to avoid COVID. Jesus, what a victory.
Well, more than might have been feared. We avoided it more than might have been feared by us and by our listeners. All right, everybody out there, thank you for listening. Thanks for sticking with us. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and to our sponsor, CN Rail. And everybody, we'll see you next week with some more, including handicapping potential replacements for Aaron O'Toole. See you next week.